Couple of things I wanted to talk about. First of all, I think it's wonderful you're finding ways to try to raise money. I understand that. As a former president of the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable, we have the same discussions and the same problems, same issues at work for us. Our numbers are actually quite a bit lower than they've been for a long time. The pandemic, of course, didn't help, but then there are other things that have dealt with that as well. So fundraising is a big issue for everybody, and so everything you can do to support your roundtable will be much appreciated and will enable it to continue to function. One of the things that the Atlanta Roundtable does is give us a book prize, and that's a really well-received book prize by the people that get it, and I've been lucky enough to receive it through the years before I ended up being sort of how shall we say it, neutralized by becoming a member of the book committee. So one way to avoid not getting the award is to put you on the committee that gives the award. So then you're locked up, so to speak. It's kind of like my knee. And actually the latest book that I had written, Civil War book, was Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Mortality in the Civil War. And that's the one that got the award before I then joined the committee and got neutralized. Now, I want to tell you a story before I begin. I am indeed the director of the Center for the Study of the Civil War Era. Kent was kind enough to actually say the whole title. You can say Civil War Center if you want. We do not have a museum. We do have some display cases, and we have programs, and one of our best programs was Kent Brown coming up to speak to us at our Vince Dooley Leadership Seminar. And so Kent did an outstanding job. Yeah, thank you, Kent, for doing that. And the other person was Craig Simons. We were talking about Craig, some of us, about how he is an outstanding speaker and does a great job himself. So we've been very lucky to have good speakers, and then every now and then I show up, and they have to put up with that the best they can. Now, I wanted to tell you a story, and I think that I may have told this story before, and if I have, as my father-in-law used to say, I'm going to tell it again, and you can act like you've not heard it the first time. But Virginians are very proud, and a Virginian and a Texan were arguing about their relative worth, their relative importance, and the Texan said, you know, I can get in my truck and go all day and never reach the other end of my property. And the Virginian kind of scratched his chin whiskers and he said, yeah, I had a truck like that once. So you have to put it in perspective. And I do have a Kentucky version of that because Virginians and Kentuckians are proud people. And a Virginian was talking to a Kentuckian and he was telling how important Virginia was, the great Commonwealth of Virginia. And he was telling him about the fact that Virginia is the mother of presidents. And Virginia has beaches and mountains. It has Virginia Smithfield ham, which is really, there is nothing else like Smithfield ham, and many other things. And he finally looked at him and says, well, what does Kentucky have? And the fellow looked at him and went, bourbon. And the Virginian did one of those Jim Hardy Wells Fargo things and walked off. Because he couldn't answer that when you got Kentucky and you got bourbon. Of course, you got basketball, too, and horses. Elizabeth and I come up to Keeneland a lot, and we enjoy our visits. Our daughter went to, I think I probably told you this, went to UK as well. All of my degrees are somewhere else, so you have to forgive me. And 2 of my degrees are from Georgia, so you have to forgive that altogether. I said the fateful visit. One of the things that we're going to talk tonight about is William Dorsey Pender, who's a person that most folks don't know a whole lot about. How many of you have heard of Dorsey Pender at all? Pender becomes very close to Mr. Shepherd, to young Mr. Sam Shepherd. And he ends up going home with him and visiting in his home after they graduate from West Point. And he meets Fanny. And that's where he meets Fanny the first time. He sees her playing the piano and he falls in love with her. And then unfortunately, as typically will happen, you get assigned to duties that take you into harm's way, whether that's harm's way by virtue of enemy fire or if that's something else. In this case, when Samuel Turner Shepherd went to Fort Leavenworth, to Kansas, to that area, he ended up contracting disease and dying relatively quickly, very, very soon, only 24 years old when he died of disease at Fort Leavenworth. In some ways, I think it was the loss of this brother, somebody he looked at as a literal brother in West Point, but also a potential brother-in-law, because he would fallen in love with the sister. And he, I think, thought marrying her would certainly make sense to him. I think that tragedy brought them even closer together. So sometimes, even in the worst of circumstances, something good can come out of it. And William Dorsey Pender, or Dorsey as he was known by most people, or sometimes Dorse, will end up marrying Mary Frances Pender. So Mary Frances Shepherd. So she ends up being a Pender at that point. One of the things he does is, of course, he goes off to serve as well. And here's a picture of him as a younger officer in March 1861. But before he gets into that position, he does see some service in the far northwest. In other words, if you go to Washington State today and you see Coeur d'Alene and you see some other places up in that area, those are areas that he would have served in the old army. And he was actually in some of the fighting that that took place there, and involved in a number of small campaigns, but still saw combat, and achieved also a certain amount of experience that will come back to make him feel like he's better prepared for whatever the fates might provide for him as time goes on. So he's basically posted at Fort Walla Walla, Washington, and spends most of his time out in that part of the field. One of the things, and I'll go ahead and skip a little bit because it kind of ties in to something I want to talk about. If you look at the bottom, that's a picture of Andrew Jackson Smith. Smith was a captain in that posting out in Walla Walla, Washington, and when Pender married Mary Frances, she went out to be with him and stayed at the post. And while he was out on these excursions, for lack of better terms, because most of the time it wasn't combat related, he did get some combat experience, but not a ton of it. You know, it's like everything else. You spend a lot of your time hunting that which you cannot find. But at any rate, while he was gone, apparently one of the things they would do back at the post was to occasionally have parties or gatherings. And he would write to his wife and tell her what he was doing, what he was experiencing. He would try to share his time in the field with her. But he was trying to also keep a wary eye on Captain Smith. Captain Andrew Jackson Smith apparently liked to dance with the beautiful ladies. And so one of the things that he will tell his wife as he gets the news that she's dancing with the post commander, that he's not happy about that he doesn't want her dancing with anybody but him. Well, he's in the field. It's going to be hard to dance with him until he can get back. And then when he finally does come back, of course, it's not long before the circumstances will require a very different posting and a very different set of responsibilities and authorities. But I kind of skipped forward so you could see a picture of Andrew Jackson Smith and the comment that he will make about dancing with Smith, and that he does not want her to do that, because that'll come back in a way to haunt him. Okay, when the war breaks out, interestingly enough, Pender's, one of the first things he does is he precedes North Carolina. Remember, there's two waves of secession. The Deep South goes out in the early wave, and then the Upper South goes out in the second wave in response to Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. I don't have to teach you, I think, the basics about American history. I'm sure you know Fort Sumter's where the firing took place, but the real crux of the matter is when you start activating the militia, when you start calling on 75,000 volunteers, and you say that the states have to provide quotas, and those quotas would be used against these areas in rebellion against the government, then Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas have to make choices. And the vote in Virginia kind of flip-flopped. If you go with the earliest vote about secession, it was actually pretty heavily against secession. And then this second time, when it rolls around, it's the opposite. It flips around to being in favor of secession. So one of the things that happens is Pender's actually going to resign his commission and look for other opportunities within the fledgling Confederate States of America, even before North Carolina has made its decision. And one of the things they do is send him to Baltimore to recruit. I always thought that was a fascinating thing that we don't think about, is where do you go to find the kind of able-bodied people that might be the best suited to field forces as you start to contemplate raising armies. And so he went to Baltimore to try to find sympathetic people. And in Maryland, in that part of Maryland, finding people who were sympathetic to the South would not be out of the realm of possibility. It would be the place that would be the most common of places in Maryland itself. On the way back, he gets word about Fort Sumter. He also begins to contemplate other things, and in the end, he ends up basically being a drill sergeant. So those are sort of the key components of his early experience of the war. In 1861, he is going to be basically a glorified drill sergeant, trying to get men ready for warfare. And so he is from Tarboro himself. She is from Salem. Her family is from Salem. He will be in Raleigh doing most of this work. Again, not particularly glorious or glamorous work. Eventually, he'll work his way up to Weldon. You notice that Weldon is right on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And it becomes sort of a jumping off point for him to move into Virginia itself. And when he comes into Virginia, he's going to be posted at Suffolk, Virginia. Well, if you didn't pick up from any of my biography or whatever it is that got passed around, I am a native of Suffolk, Virginia. And the book that I wrote about that region was called The War Hits Home, because for me, it is home, and the war hit home. But it also hit home for all of the people living there and all of the people that would come there from other places. And Pender was one of those people that would come there from North Carolina to be in Suffolk for a period of time, not yet on the front lines by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly moving in that general direction. And I think one of the things that is fascinating about that was how he is learning to be, as he's already been a husband, so he's kind of figured out how to do that a little bit, although as you'll see, not particularly well. He's a father, so he's learning how to do that, but he's doing it from a distance. Most of the heavy lifting is being done by Fanny back at home. And he's learning to be an officer. So he's learning to be a lot of the things that he will be expected to do as this war moves forward and as his role in it occurs. So in early Suffolk, Virginia, in the early part of the war, while it's still in Confederate hands, and one of the things about Suffolk, it was a third of the war in Confederate hands, a third of the war in Union hands, and a third of the war, the last third of the war, in the worst situation, it was a no man's land, where it was susceptible to raids and operations from forces of both sides. But in Suffolk, which was a small farming community, they did have a desire to try to entertain the troops that came in, and these North Carolinians would be received by local citizens, not only because they would reside on their grounds to train and to prepare themselves, but also to be entertained. There were times they were bring the officers in for Sunday dinners or some kind of gatherings for all kinds of different activities that you might imagine. And this is what William Dorsey Pender says to his wife, who is back home in North Carolina. My regiment is keeping up its reputation thus far. Well, it hadn't done anything. So it's kind of interesting that it was keeping up its reputation, but in his mind, merely being there and trying to teach them how to be good soldiers was doing what they were expected to do. And he felt like so far they were living up to that. And I only hope it will continue to do so. Honey, I flatter myself, Well, you never have to worry about Dorsey Pender's reliance on other people to flatter him. He will be happy to flatter himself. And so he says, honey, I flatter myself that thus far no one need be ashamed of me. Now, I think it's insightful to put that out there because we don't think of these people as having the kinds of uncertainties or doubts or questions. They're supposed to be these military figures who seem to have certitude about everything and they're prepared for everything. Well, he's clearly, whenever you say no one has to be ashamed of me, he's worried about people being ashamed of him. And he's not just worried about her being ashamed of him, but he is worried about her being ashamed. He is worried about himself. He doesn't want to let himself down. And I think, again, we forget that these people are human beings that have these foibles in them. I occupy a position, a high position for one so young. He is a young man. He's only in his 20s. And have been able to sustain myself thus far. Honey, why should I not be satisfied in this work? And I think that was the other thing. We forget, again, these folks are ambitious people. They have egos. And so he has the notion that he would like to be in certain circumstances where he has a better chance for advancement, the hope for some kind of glory in the martial field. You're not going to get that teaching soldiers to be soldiers, teaching civilians to be soldiers in Raleigh. You're not even going to do that at Weldon, where your greatest claim to fame is that you kicked the settlers out so they wouldn't get everybody drunk. That was his claim to fame in Weldon, that he'd gotten the settlers off to about a couple miles away where he could keep his eye on them. And even at Suffolk, where he's now surrounded by adoring people who are telling him how great he is, he knows that's not where this kind of glory is going to come from. You're going to have to get to the front. You're going to have to get to the front. We were talking about somebody who had been hit in the head 3 times when he got shot. It sounds an awful lot like Dorsey Pender. In some ways, maybe you've got to be careful what you wish for, because it might turn out that you don't want what comes. Okay, this is what Pender says. I have a fine regiment. He knew that the regiment reflected on him. Nice gentlemen who treat me with the greatest deference. A fine horse. I was telling my students the other day, when you talk about Southern honor, the whole notion of the fact that everything about you, your self-worth, depends on what others think of you. What do others say about you? And so your horse reflects that. Who you marry reflects that. The house you live in reflects that. Even if you own slaves, that reflects that. And I always said it reminded me of growing up with kennel ration. Do you remember kennel ration? How many of us remember kennel ration? Isn't that that was a great dog food. We used to open it up and then glob it out onto the thing, and there it was, a big stack of something I wouldn't eat if I was a dog, but there it was. And if you remember the commercial, it said, my dog's bigger than your dog. My dog's bigger than yours. My dog's bigger because he eats kennel ration. That is a Southern commercial. Even if it wasn't, it was. Even if it wasn't a Southern commercial, it was. Because your dog being bigger mattered. It was bigger, and that reflected on you. So listen to what Pender is saying. He says, I have a fine horse, a good mount. I'm not sure what the difference is. I guess the way he seats himself on the horse and how the horse carries him. The good opinion of the world. The good opinion of the world. And oh, he doesn't say by the way, give him credit for at least that much. And oh, the best wife in the world. The best wife in the world. So remember, he's off in Virginia seeing the war, going to cotillions, having tea, getting a couple of dances in. He's having a big old time. And back at home, she's got the 2 children. She'd had a bad pregnancy. I mean, it's a lot of stuff going on, and she's stuck at home. But he threw her a bone. She's the best wife in the world. I am treated with the greatest kindness by the people. Several invitations to dine today, as well as Sunday invitations to tea. Dine today, and yes, he's going to say it. I'm just going to prepare you. I'm going to stop for a second. I had a student in class, my Civil War and Reconstruction class, and I read him a story from a gouging contest that pitted a Virginian and a Kentuckian. I don't want to tell you how that turned out. You just ate. It does. You don't want to hear it. You don't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear it either. When I got through reading what the diarist of the colonial period said in his diary, my student had to excuse himself because he was sick. Now that's pretty dramatic. That's pretty dramatic. He felt sick. He said, Dr. Wills, can you warn me next time if there's going to be something graphic? I said, son, this is a Civil War class. This is a Civil War class. I think there's going to be some stuff you better watch what you eat, or be prepared. Be prepared, in the good words of the scouting master. So I was, I'm reminded that sometimes we have these things that make us a little squeamish. Sometimes they're a little thing, and you're about to get hit by one of those squeamish moments. Okay, dine today with the most beautiful girl in Suffolk. He's telling his wife. He's telling his wife. There are times when it's best not to share some information. It's sometimes best not to say certain things. And not only that, it has a great many very pretty ones. So it isn't just this one that he was at dinner with, but it has many others as well. This is the most pleasant little town. Well, I wonder why. I wonder why. The kindest and most hospitable people I ever saw anywhere. The ladies keep my table covered with flowers and smile on me in the most bewitching manner. He's telling his wife back home. And some of them are certainly like pinks. The colonel is quite a lion. He's talking about himself. The colonel is quite a lion. So I said in this chapter, a lion is in the streets. I think in my Pender, in my book, I think the lion roars. The lion roars. Okay. All right. The colonel is quite a lion. Now here he is. He's husband. He's going to put the law down. Do not be jealous. Do not be jealous, for none of them have the attractiveness of Mrs. W.D. Pender. And I have not failed to let them know I am married for, and he underlines this, poor creatures, I do not wish to destroy their rest. Now let me say that in English for those of you who didn't understand that. He has just said that these women will not be able to sleep at night unless he tells them he's taken, that he's married. And once he's told them that he's married, that'll calm them down. They can sleep at night now. They can rest. He doesn't want to destroy their rest. Okay? The flirtatiousness, nevertheless, continues on their part and, frankly, on his part. Now, I did have a scholar friend of mine, Stephen Barry. You know Stephen, don't you? And Stephen said that he thought that he may have done some things he should not have done. I'm just going to tell you that I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I don't believe he had an affair with anybody. I think he's just full of himself. And he's full of himself, and he talks about himself. He bloviates. Isn't that a great word? A bloviator. A bloviator. Okay. They probably don't say that in court. Bloviator. Because then who would you say? Which attorney is the bloviator? or is that the judge? I don't know. But I'm married to a judge, by the way. Juvenile and domestic relations judge. She's the longest sitting judge in Virginia. And it was marry me or go to jail. And you see which one I did. I just put that out there. She doesn't like that either. She doesn't like that either. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk and move on. On June 23rd, 1861, he refers to a lady who expressed her wish to make him an article of clothing. She said she wanted to make him something to wear. He did say that she is trying to kind of flirt with him, but he said if she tries, she'll see who is the loser. She's going to be the loser in that effort. The lady must have been determined, for as the colonel explained, quote, she has intimated once or twice that she has fallen in love with me. She has fallen in love with me. Now, for him to feel that way is one thing. He's telling his wife. He's telling his wife. Okay? On June 26, he wrote Fanny, I was at a gathering 2 nights ago. Another gathering. I think we got to learn the gatherings are probably not good ideas, and certainly talking about them are not good ideas. But listen to this. He goes, he just is amazing. I had an uncle who lived in Greensboro, North Carolina. I did a talk on Pender for his Kiwanis Club. And he said, Pender's just a little lamb. Meaning he's so innocent, he doesn't get that he's really not, this is not good, that he's not doing himself any favors. I said, no, he sure didn't. We'll have to see how that turns out. All right, the lady must have been pretty determined because she intimated once or twice that she'd fallen in love with me. I was at a gathering 2 nights ago and had a very nice time dancing, we're back to the dancing thing, and flirting with a very nice girl. I am trying to get her to knit you a sack for the hair, but she has said she's not going to work for my wife, but will do anything for me. Anything for me. Okay? And he's telling his wife this. Okay? Apparently, this was enough for Fanny to feel the need to address the matter. Okay? And so she writes back a letter that says, read to end. If you get such a letter, throw in trash. It's not going to be good. It's going to hurt your feelings. It's not going to make you feel good. And so she says the start of it, the kids are fine, we're getting along, we're doing the best we can, I'm sure you're doing the best you can, blah, blah, blah. And then she hits, I think she was trying to hold off, and then bam, she can't help it. I have never in the whole course of my married life done anything that I know would pain you, she tells him. Your will has always been my law, and I have ever tried to obey the very letter of the commands of my Lord and Master. You say that the ladies seem to think I am a very superior woman. It would be a great pity to undeceive them, and might detract somewhat from your distinction among them. On the flirting incident, she says, now I ask you candidly, in your sober senses, why did you write me such a thing as that? Why did you write me such a thing as that? She says, I feel indignant that any woman would have dared to make such loose speeches to my husband, and that he should have encouraged it by his attentions, for you must have gone pretty far for a woman to attempt such a liberty. She lays him out. When he writes back, the reason we have what she wrote is he wrote a note at the bottom. Tonight, this war holds no more terrors for me. No more terrors for me. And later on, now we can go back to this if I figured out what I did with everything. Here it is. All right. I said Dorsey Pender's Rhett Butler. It's just a joke off the movies a little bit. But later on he writes, and it's pretty quick. He doesn't wait that long. My dancing days are over. My dancing days are over. So just remember, he chewed her out for dancing with Captain Smith, and here he's been chronicling every time he's danced and everything somebody said anything to him. Now, I just think that's a fascinating piece of Civil War history because it's, again, the side of it that we don't typically see. We usually see the martial side, or maybe we see some things about letters and so forth. Now, in terms of what military experience Pender will have, I'm just going to go through a couple of highlights for you and talk about a few of the things to show you that he really did make a contribution to the war effort, at least to the best of his ability. Now, when he left Suffolk, and it will be very shortly after that little contretemps takes place about dancing and flirting and hair sacks and all that other stuff, he does end up going off to Ben's church, which is on the way over towards the peninsula, and he does talk about the women that he is dealing with at that point, but he describes them very clearly as older women who are there to help the sick soldiers. Okay, so the whole attitude has shifted somewhat. Remember, he's also going to write, my dancing days are over. I really do think he finally figured it out. She laid him out, and he got it. And he understood that kind of behavior can win him no friends where the friends matter most, and that's at home. You might win a few fake friends from the party, but you ain't going to win the real friend back home. Now, Pender is going to end up becoming a part of the major operations of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia. First place he's going to see service is in the Peninsula Campaign, and the primary area of his service is Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. And at Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, he is actually going to maneuver his soldiers, his troops, very well. He's going to show that in combat he can be cool and he can be collected. He can make sure that the men know what is expected of them and they're put into the best opportunity to achieve results. Now, I put the peninsula here just to give you the principal figures: Joe Johnston, George McClellan, there's John Bankhead Magruder, Prince John Magruder. And, of course, the fact that Magruder managed to convince McClellan to hold off and dig in and bring up heavy siege guns, while the main thing that Prince John had against him was Quaker guns and a relatively small number of troops. They're called Quaker guns because they're logs made to look like guns, and they ain't going to fire very far. Logs are not going to fire very far. But here's the Seven Pines fighting that Pender's a part of, and he will be in the thick of the fighting. The good news is he survives as far as his personal safety is concerned. I'm sure that for Fanny that was most important. She was deeply religious. As I mentioned, his family was not particularly religious. In fact, he made the point that he would hope she might help win them over and help convert them. He will be converted, and as I said, he will be actually baptized in front of his regiment. But notice this kind of interesting little comment at the bottom, if you can see it. General Pender, I salute you. Well, who said that? Jefferson Davis. So if you feel like that the eyes of the world are important, especially certain people in the world, I don't think you get a more important set of eyes than that. President Jefferson Davis saying, you're doing a good job. General Pender, I salute you. There's one small problem with that. Who's not a general? Pender. He will be, but he's not yet. And this is really not a battlefield promotion. Was it in his excitement that Jeff Davis was giving him an elevation, or did he probably really just not know? I don't know. Who knows? Pender will have a couple of incidents that we don't get a lot of information about what brought them about, and one of them refers to or relates to Robert E. Lee, which we'll see in short order here. But he's not going to be promoted on the battlefield. He's not, he's going to go through the normal routine, and he is going to be elevated to generalship, to the ranks of higher office as in a more traditional way. All right, in the 7 days, there you got Robert E. Lee taking over. Of course, he's going to take the reins after Joe Johnston's wounded. Brief time that someone else could have stepped in, doesn't seem to be that interested in stepping in. And then Robert E. Lee does, and the history of the Army of Northern Virginia, as it comes to be known, changes. And right there with Robert E. Lee is William Dorsey Pender. Now, Pender is acutely aware and proud of being a North Carolinian. If you've ever heard the old saying that North Carolina is the veil of humility between two peaks of conceit. One of those peaks is Virginia. The other is actually Charleston, not South Carolina. So it's Charleston. But it doesn't matter where those peaks of conceit are. The veil of humility is Pender's world. And there was the feeling that Robert E. Lee favored Virginians. And so, again, one of the things that Pender was always looking for and angling for is how do I get the right eyes on what I'm doing so that they see, they note what I'm doing, but also so that I can get elevated in rank. And elevated in rank is his goal. He doesn't see action throughout the entire 7 days, but he sees some of the earliest and bloodiest action at Mechanicsville, and really much more the case at Beaver Dam Creek. Mechanicsville was really kind of a little running movement of troops forward, and then they run into Beaver Dam Creek, which is not going to be that easy a natural obstacle to overcome. And Pender is part of the force on the right that's positioned along with Roswell Ripley. You'll notice that Those units are on the right. And I've put a woodcut to show you kind of what the conditions were illustrated to look like at the time, and a modern photograph to give you a sense of the swampy nature of the uncertain terrain. Again, you can see Mechanicsville's off in the distance just a little bit. The fighting really is going to be along Beaver Dam Creek. And again, Pender's going to perform well. He's not going to do any better or any worse than anybody else, because when he's trying to bash his way across that natural obstacle, it's going to be fighting an uphill battle almost literally, because you come out of the swamp into the teeth of heavy Union fire. And so they're going to sustain losses. Pender's troops sustain losses. So he's not going to just automatically kind of show that he's the best general that's ever walked on a field of battle. He's not Napoleon reincarnated. And to his I think, credit, he doesn't try to paint himself that way. If anything, as time goes on, he comes to admire Robert E. Lee as something extraordinary. It was Robert E. Lee who had the Napoleonic type of flair and capability in his estimation. So he doesn't try to elevate himself above his raising, as we might say, in Southwest Virginia. He is not going to see much action for the rest of the 7 days, but then he is going to see action at 2nd Manassas at Bull Run when it's the second time around. And you'll notice that he's right in the middle of the position that Stonewall Jackson's trying to hold in the unfinished railroad line, where the troops not only run out of ammunition trying to fight, but have to pick up and fight with rocks and stones. Well, Pender's going to be right in the heart of that, and Pender's also going to be wounded. Now, you'll notice that he talks about, I am safe and sound with the exception of a small cut. Of course, he's telling his wife what his circumstance is. He's telling her what has happened to him. A shell has hit him on the top of his head. Now, just to show you again that Pender was not highly regarded by every single person that knew him. He could be, as you kind of saw in that first phase of his life, very ambitious, very conceited, vainglorious, however you want to say it. One of his subordinate officers will say, I wish that the shell had taken his damn head off. So imagine that you have somebody that serves with you that doesn't think maybe as highly of you as you do of yourself. Okay, the opposing armies converge in Maryland. Remember that he's now been in the 7 days. He's been in the peninsula. He's been earlier in the Peninsula campaign and in the 7 days. Then he's been at 2nd Manassas. Now he's actually engaged in this first major operation to move into Maryland, and where he makes his great contribution is at Harper's Ferry. Pender's involved in an operation to seize an area along the line of the Union defenses that would actually, if you can hold it, constitute high ground in a low area. Remember that you've got this enormous set of mountains and hills above Harper's Ferry, but Harper's Ferry itself, not as much high ground, and there's one hill that's pretty strategic, pretty important. And it's Pender that's going to be the one tasked with taking that position, and he actually does. So again, he doesn't always make a great contribution everywhere he goes, but in this case he does. And it makes a critical contribution because it creates the circumstance, along with the other situations that have arisen by holding much higher ground, of forcing the Federals to surrender. And when they surrender Harper's Ferry, look at the haul that the Confederacy will get in terms of prisoners of war, in terms of equipment, in terms of everything else. When you think about, you can take thousands of prisoners, 73 cannon, wagons, almost everything else that you can think of, this would be a pretty significant thing. But I think even more important, think about the soldiers. And the soldiers' army, an army has to march on his stomach. So look at the bottom of the list where you've got all of this hard bread, bacon, salt pork, beef, and coffee. What a nice luxury to have some real coffee. And so Pender's involved in that. But because he's involved in this operation, and he's tied down with what happens after this as they begin to try to process all this. He's not at Antietam, Sharpsburg. So one of the things maybe he's lucky that he didn't have to face was the bloodshed of the bloodiest single day of the Civil War at Harper's Ferry. He's with A.P. Hill as he finally comes up, but only sees minimal fighting. Where he sees his big action is just after Antietam at Shepherdstown. That's where he will see a pretty heavy combat action that he participates in that aftermath of Antietam, Sharpsburg on September 19th. And I always think it's interesting because, again, when I wrote about Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's always looked at as very bloodthirsty. Somebody, I think, picked up the Fort Pillow book. What I try to do with my Fort Pillow book was show that excess happens in war, and it just didn't happen at Fort Pillow. It happened before Fort Pillow. It happened after Fort Pillow. It happened before the Civil War. It happened after the Civil War. When I'm describing things in the American Revolution with some of the bloody fights that took place in the South and bloody Tarleton and some of the things that were done there. The Philippine insurrection. You want to talk about a nasty little war? Study the Philippine insurrection. That's a nasty little war. The Americans practiced what was known as the water cure. Basically, you filled a person up with as much water as possible and then stomped it out. And then if they didn't tell you what you wanted them to tell you, or what you wanted them to say, then you did it again. Okay? The response for the Filipinos was to take the soldier who might try to pick up a prostitute or somebody that's at a bar or whatever, and then you find them the next day with their throat slit. Or even worse, staked out, intestines removed, smeared with jelly to let the ants take care of things. Now, you're talking about nasty war, because wars are nasty. Now, we're not talking about Vietnam, and we're not even talking about the Pacific, and we're not talking about Fort Pillow, because some people think that that's the case, that Fort Pillow is a, quote, massacre where these horrific things occurred. Now, my argument, Forrest lost control of the battle. He shouldn't have lost control of the battle, and he did, and people were killed that should not have been killed. There's no question. And some of the ways that people have tried to use Forrest's own words against him are his descriptions in his report where he uses the term slaughter. And they said, see, he wants to wipe people out. That's his goal. Well, I put this up here so you could compare and contrast. Ambrose Powell Hill in his report then commenced the most terrible slaughter, because war can result in slaughter. It isn't necessarily massacre or murder. It's the fact that people are putting themselves in harm's way and significant numbers of them are being affected in a negative fashion. Killed, wounded, etc. The broad surface of the Potomac was blue with the floating bodies of our foe, but few escaped to tell the tale. And part of the reason that happened was William Dorsey Pender's actions at Shepherdstown that produced those casualties for the Union. Now, it also reminds me of that description of Ball's Bluff. If you ever study Ball's Bluff, it was a terrible, small action that nevertheless left the Potomac filled with the bodies of Union soldiers as they tried to flee back across the Potomac from Virginia to the north of the Potomac River. You notice the skewed casualties, skewed losses more heavily to the Union side. But you'll notice that they're not inconsequential for the Confederates either. Pender's men took a beating. They gave a beating, but they took a beating as well. All right, Fredericksburg. I wanted to make this point to you as we begin to wrap up Pender's military career, that everybody thinks that Ambrose Everett Burnside's the worst general in world history, the worst one it ever was. Okay? Tell that to the people who try to defend Roanoke Island, and tell that to James Longstreet at Knoxville. But just in case you don't want to tell them that, take the worst situation that he faced and look at how it, but for a little twist, could have been very different. Because one of the places where the Confederates were vulnerable and Burnside almost made them pay the price was on their flank, not at Marye's Heights, not at the stone wall. And had it not been for Pender and others, but Pender was a big player in this particular situation, George Gordon Meade may not have had to wait to Gettysburg to be a hero. He might have been the hero of Fredericksburg. Because if he punches his way through and gets to break the line of Stonewall Jackson, then they roll up the Confederate flank and come in behind the stone wall. Think about how very different that situation might have been. It's among others, you'll notice he's not the only one, and the gallant Pelham is one of the most famous folks for engaging in this effort here. But Dorsey Pender does his fair share of sealing the breach, of keeping that breach from being worse than it was. It was a very momentary breach in that line that he helped to seal up. And there's a marker for the area where that fighting took place. All right, Chancellorsville. You don't necessarily think of William Dorsey Pender being there, but not only was he there, he was part of that attempt to roll up the Union lines, to force the Federals to retreat in disarray. And then, unfortunately, Stonewall Jackson goes out, having executed this flank attack, rides out in front of the lines to scout, comes down to another point in the lines and tries to re-enter them with people not sure who he is or who they are, and they fire on them, and the party is struck, including, of course, Stonewall Jackson. Now, Stonewall Jackson isn't killed outright. As you know, he was wounded, severely wounded. He will undergo tremendous trauma, amputation and trauma, all kinds of issues, though it's more likely he died of septic peritonitis than he did of pneumonia. Just saying. A lot of people thought he died of pneumonia. I thought he died of pneumonia all those years. But my friend Bud Robertson said that he asked doctors, and they felt like that it was more likely to be septic peritonitis. But you'll notice that top quote, "You must hold your ground, General Pender." Who is saying that? Stonewall Jackson. Who is he saying it to? William Dorsey Pender. Why? William Dorsey Pender knew that Stonewall Jackson had been struck down, and and the attack itself, because any attacking forces are going to be in as much disarray as defending forces. Any battle, that's why it's hard to follow up attacks. It's also why people like Forrest understood how important it was to follow up attacks. Because if you let them rally, the enemy can be as dangerous as if you hadn't beaten them in the first place. Because you may not be in a position to hold your line. Pender was worried about that. And so he told Stonewall Jackson, we may have to tighten our position, consolidate our line. We may have to strengthen our position. And that's when Stonewall Jackson may have given his last field order to William Dorsey Pender. You hold your line. Don't reposition, don't reconfigure, don't consolidate. You hold your line. Now, another thing that's interesting. That battle goes on. Longstreet's not there. Where was Longstreet? Suffolk. Longstreet wasn't there. So part of the reason that Lee has to improvise is because he doesn't have a choice. He's got to do some dramatic stuff. That's where the flank movement comes in and some of his other choices. But he's also dealing with a situation where he ultimately gets the high ground at Hazel Grove. They fire artillery rounds towards Joe Hooker's headquarters, apparently hitting a column, which knocks it into Hooker, who knocks him down. If you've ever had a concussion, you know what that might be like. It addles you. It maybe even makes you so that you can't function. Okay? So, that battle doesn't just end with Jackson's assault or even Jackson's wounding. It continues on. When finally there's supposed to be a massive attack, because that's what Lee really liked. Let's hit them. Hit them. A massive attack, and Pender is supposed to be one of the men to carry out that attack. That's what Lee thought of Pender. He's my fighting Carolinian. I'm going to put him out there. He's going to get the job done. But you'll notice that by that point, Hooker is retreated and the moment has been lost. And nobody more than Robert E. Lee understood a lost moment. Now, if you come to Georgia, I can show you a major lost moment in the Atlanta campaign at Snake Creek Gap in Resaca, where McPherson, who is supposed to be the best man that Sherman has, misses the opportunity to capture Resaca and trap Joe Johnston in Dalton, Georgia. And what does Sherman say? He says, Mac, you missed the great opportunity of the war. You missed it. Well, what does Robert E. Lee say when he finds out the Federals have retreated and he can't launch that blow to knock them out once and for all? Why, General Pender, that is what you young men always do. You allow those people, that's how he referred to the Yankees, those people, to get away. I tell you what to do, but you don't do it. Go after them and damage them all you can. Now, I can tell you that Dorsey Pender had to be mortified, because there'd be nothing else but mortification for him that Robert E. Lee would have any question or any doubt or any uncertainty about his commitment, his enthusiasm, and his capability. He does not send a lot of discussion about this to Fanny, I can tell you. He doesn't send any discussion of this to Fanny, okay? She doesn't need to know this one. This is not something she needs to know. Okay? So just understand, it's funny how, he's matured, but that maturity also reflects those same uncertainties and foibles of his own personality. Now finally, Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee goes north again, faces off against George Gordon Meade, who had missed the chance to be a hero at Fredericksburg. Maybe he can redeem himself at Gettysburg. And Pender will be part of the first day's action as the Confederates eventually push back the Federal defenders through the town of Gettysburg onto the high ground beyond it. And if you've ever watched the movie, Sam Elliott, the high ground, the high ground. I always thought Sam Elliott ought to be a Confederate. He doesn't need to be a Yankee, but that's another point. Okay, and notice I say North Carolina points the way. Could Pender have pointed the way to victory at Gettysburg? Well, on day one, he does pretty much as he can do. He does the best he can. He takes over as the assault then goes into sort of that second wave, and he drives the Federals through the town to the high ground beyond. But again, forces that are as broken up in assault as they are in defense are not in positions to do much more than that. And the worst thing you can do is try to do too much and then lose what you've gotten so far. So a good commander has to know when to pull the switch. I have to stop, regroup, replenish, resupply, get fresh leadership in place because you've suffered casualties and taken officer hits, etc., etc. All right. The human costs at Gettysburg include William Dorsey Pender. Not on day one, on day two. Day two, he may or may not have been a part of a plan to strike in concert with other attacks on the flanks of either side, Culp's Hill and the Round Tops. We'll never know because part of what he was doing was reconnoitering and testing and checking things. In fact, sometimes probing to see what was possible. And then as he starts to hear firing, he says, that sounds like fighting. We've got to go and determine what's happening and what it means. And it's at that point where a shell hits him in the thigh, ripping into his leg and knocking him out of action. Pender will survive. You've written about Pender's movement back to Virginia. He will end up coming all the way back to Stanton in a springless wagon. Certainly probably one of the most horrific ways to be wounded and carried from one point to another. He will have some ability to sort of stabilize himself, and then the wound reopens, basically, for lack of better terms. And at that point, the decision's made to amputate, and he doesn't survive much longer after that. 29 years old, a child on the way that he will never see. And William Dorsey Pender, for all of what might have been the promise of what he could have done at Gettysburg or what he could do for the remainder of the war, is gone. He'll end up being buried in Tarboro, beautiful, we were talking about the church grounds and the tomb and so forth. Again, notice the reflection and his sense of what his life had been all about, I think reflected very well in the verse and the description, patriot by nature, soldier by training, Christian by faith. You know, he'd met he finished the race, as the Bible verse would say. So on February 6, 1834, Pender comes into the world. July 18th, as a result of that wound that came as a result of Gettysburg on the second day, 1863, he leaves the world. I think, again, poignantly, he says, my only regret is to leave my wife, Fanny, leave her and our 2 children. He doesn't know the third is on the way. Fanny will follow him, but a long way down the line. Not until 1922 does Mary Frances Fanny Shepherd Pender pass away herself. And with that, I'm going to call it a night for me. And if you have questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them or see whatever else might come to your mind.